Princes and Priests. Chapter 8. The Bog. Morning came early, but they all emerged, despite their weariness, to see the land they had come to. The village was mostly sunken and had been abandoned for a long time. The huts that hadn't begun to be lost in the mud were repaired with old leathers and scraps of canvas. A wall of fog rose up thick, gray, foul, and unclean, obscuring all that was beyond about 100 yards. The fog itself was what was reeking so badly. It left the skin feeling dirty and the lungs heavy. There was more to it than a mere stink, and they all felt it. They wandered the village, realizing it wasn't as deserted as they had thought. A few skinny-legged children crept close, but were scared and stayed mostly hidden. Raven nodded to Oirion, and the two men wandered off together to find out what else was in the village. On the far end, they found a little old woman. She looked not quite human, being too thin and too small, with large ears that jutted out the sides of her head through her lanky white hair. She squinted up at them through deep wrinkles. Before her was a small smoky fire, warming a stone to cook her meal on. She was grinding up some root in a stone bowl.
"A dwarf,"
she exclaimed, raising her heavy eyebrows in surprise. She chuckled. Her language, the old trade tongue, made her hard to understand, not only because of her thick accent, but also her lack of teeth.
"You lost?"
"Not quite lost, just misplaced, my dear,"
Revan said back pleasantly, going into priest mode.
"Your village has seen better days, I see. What has happened here?"
She grunted.
Much,
she said.
"And you, handsome one, you smell like a puritan, but you don't look like one."
"We travel with a puritan,"
Oirion said.
"By chance you smell him?"
No,
she considered, but was sure.
"Come and sit at the fire with me. I'm old and miss the company of fine men like you two. Have you eaten?"
"We have a camp,"
Revan said as they sat. She nodded.
"We have seen children. Are there any other adults around?"
Oirion asked, hoping for trade and maybe a better map.
"Oh, they're just lost souls. Nothing to matter over. Are you sure I cannot make you a bite?"
She looked up as Shannon emerged out of the mist. As he came closer, the old woman hissed at him and shrank back.
"Leave them alone, old woman,"
he said.
"I did no harm,"
she said in her defense.
"No harm to the priests, just a few words. I'm just a lonely old woman looking out for my children. You know as well as I that the gold is blood-stained these days. Only a fool crosses a priest."
She looked him over and sneered.
"You know very well, don't you, my lord? Tell me, how does it feel to be on the other side?"
Raven felt the magic laid on him slip in her fix on Shannon, and he quickly raised the shields he had been taught to use, shields that he never thought he would need. He had heard of the Grim, but had never seen one in the world, only in study. He jumped to his feet the moment his body was his to command. She was very good. Raven hadn't even realized that it was not his will that made him sit. He whipped out the sword and lunged forward, attempting to stab her. The sword pierced through nothing but air, causing him to stagger forward and lose his balance. Shannon was quick enough to grab him and save him from falling into her. She screamed and howled with laughter as her gray, wrinkled image began to blur and swirl into the mist. The fire roared up fiercely and then instantly snuffed out, leaving only a small wisp of smoke. She was gone, but her howls of laughter lingered a bit, fading as she retreated out into the mist. Shannon looked at the two men with a hard silence. Both of the priests felt very foolish and small, like schoolboys just reprimanded for their failure to pass a test. He turned without saying a word and walked back up the village to the others. Raven grunted as he saw that his sword had rust spots on it already. With disgust, he tossed it aside. It would rust to nothing in a few hours, and if he still had it, the corrosion would spread to him.
"We need to be more careful,"
Raven said.
"But let's check her cottage."
He was careful to take as much of the blame. He was as ignorant in it as Oirion had been. Oirion now knew that she was a Grim, but he had never seen one, and was a little surprised that they still existed. Both he and Raven had been snared, and if Shannon had not come along, they would have been her toys to play with. He shuddered and was glad that he had not been alone, and that Shannon had shown up. He just hated that once again Shannon seemed to have saved his life. They went in and found the clothes, weapons, and packs of the unfortunates who had come to the village and had the misfortune of meeting the old woman. Reven kicked through it. It was mostly garbage heaped on the floor, but he did find a small pack into which he put an assortment of coins, rings, and other bits worth keeping. He found as well a sword to replace his and a staff that he tossed to Oirion.
You want that?
He asked.
I've been told you're a staff fighter.
For the first time, he let on that he knew exactly who Oirion was.
Have you?
Oirion asked, as he weighed the staff and checked it for spells. It was old and powerful, but the magic was locked and beyond his skill.
And you? What weapon do you prefer?
An axe, actually, but in public that isn't allowed.
He grinned.
Although where I spend most of my time there is no public.
They walked back, feeling a little better for the upgrade in weapons, but embarrassed for having had to be rescued by Shannon over something so elementary. Tavia had set to cooking porridge with a handful of berries. They were few, but strong and spicy, another addition from Shannon, no doubt. They had a hot meal that day, and Shannon let them rest a little longer than they seemed to have time for. Reven set the small pack down, and while they waited, he discreetly took one thing out at a time to look it over, making sure there were no harmful spells on it. Once sure, he added it to his larger pack and took another out of the small pack to repeat the process.
"What's out there?"
Theo asked, looking out at the fog that had begun to swirl and creep up toward them as the sun rose higher.
"The bog,"
Shannon said. Dave looked out with his sight and then shuddered.
"We're going into that?"
Theo asked unhappily.
"Yes."
"Will we live?"
Dave asked.
We'll be fine.
Reven said.
It's probably best that we stay in a line, though. That way we won't be stepping into anything that might swallow one of us. Shannon, you can avoid such things, can't you?
He tested just a little. Shannon gave the dwarf a hard look, but didn't reply. He didn't need to. Once the ponies were all repacked, Shannon put Travis on the top of the pack of the pony that he was going to be leading. He decided to work with the boy, teaching him how to talk a little better. He headed out, not waiting for the others. Everyone fell into step and entered the bog. At first it was just like any other wetland, but as the day wore on, the bugs got bigger and meaner, the mud got deeper, and the water began to teem with life. Shannon kept them out of the water as much as he could and made huge detours to do so. The bog was disgusting and foul. By mid-afternoon, the humidity had drained the last of their strength. With every step, they sank into the mud, releasing buzzing little bugs that made a constant cloud around their legs. Cindy fell, her hands going into the mud up to her elbows. She started to cry, shrieking about the injustice of life, flinging mud off her hands. Theo watched her a moment, then turned his back and started to walk again. Ivan took a hold of her, helped her up with one strong hand, and didn't let go. They stopped on a hillock to eat a midday meal. It was the first time under Shannon's lead that they had ever stopped, and the first time that they had felt it was all right to do so. Theo was looking forward, trying to see into the fog, but there was no way to do it. Giving up, he went over to the man who was wiping down the legs of the ponies, and who had taken over leadership. It was odd out here in this hell of mud and insects. Shannon still looked clean. His hair still had the silky quality of one who is pampered in court.
"Why's your hair like that?"
Theo asked as he looked at the lower length of Shannon's braid.
"I didn't think that there was a dye strong enough to get such a true blonde over pert and black."
Shannon stood up from his work. Theo almost apologized and turned to walk back to the others.
"It is a result of the power reflecting off the inside of my shield. I do not do it on purpose. I'm surprised an Arwensborn does not know that."
"Are you that powerful?"
Shannon smiled ever so slightly. That was the most reassuring thing that had been said or done since they had reached this hell. Theo smiled back, just a little. Shannon moved over to the other pony. With a sigh, Theo went back to searching the fog. He didn't want to sit with the others. Cindy was happily talking to Ivan, who had given her a knee to sit on, keeping her out of the mud. But standing there like an idiot was worse than walking back to where his wife was flirting with the big Ivan. He took a deep breath and rejoined the group, wishing he knew what to say to Shannon.
"What did you ask?"
Oirion asked as Theo sat down beside him.
"About his hair."
I'll never understand human fashions.
Reven said, glad to not have to listen to Ivan and Cindy. Any conversation was better than that.
He's not human. He's a Potan. There's a difference,
Kelly said, actually turning her back on the big man and the giggling butterfly.
That's not the point,
Reven said.
What is?
Kelly asked, cringing as Cindy giggled shrilly, while Ivan laughed as he tickled her.
Fashion. It's all human-driven these days, and I don't understand it. What reason would a man have for dyeing his hair or shaving it off?
He shot a look back over his shoulder.
It's not dyed.
Theo said.
It's from the reflection of his shield. At least that is what he said to me.
That's not new.
Kelly said.
It's said that the Purton masters of old were so powerful that the exposure to their own power made them turn white-haired, a white that shone gold in the sun. The very greatest of masters were the red Purtons, hair the color of blood. I had no idea any Purton alive had such power still,
she said, as she looked over at Shannon. The others looked at her, a little surprised that she would know that sort of thing. She shrugged and hunkered down. After they had eaten and Shannon was satisfied with the ponies, they headed west again. They picked up the pace the best they could and took a little less care. The less trained didn't notice, but Oirion and Revan certainly did. Shannon motioned Dave to come up near him in the lead as he handed Travis and his pony to Tavia. He then veered due north across a chest-deep pool. They all waded out after him, one at a time, chilled to the bone, but uneaten as they staggered out of the pool. Cindy was still complaining about the water and how cold it had been when, without warning, Oirion staggered. A search spell had slammed into his back. Tavia caught him before he hit the mud. He stood, the breath driven from him, trying to suck in air, his eyes watering and his hands shaking. The hunters were closer than any of the company had thought they would be. That was not a good thing. The search was way overextended, and by the force of the scan, the hunters were right behind them. Not only that, but they also knew who they were looking for.
Dave,
Shannon ordered.
Take the lead and keep moving.
He pointed westward twice, telling Dave where and how far to look to see their goal.
Reven.
Shannon and the dwarf fell back at once, running as fast as they could through the deep mud, back the way they had just come. They disappeared into the fog. Dave moved up to the front and led the way forward. He shifted his vision to sight so that he could avoid all the unpleasant things in the mud and water. It was a challenge, and he had no idea how much work it was going to be. There were the energies of life everywhere, all of them hungry, hateful, or malevolent. Dave hoped that Shannon would get back soon. He wasn't sure how long he could do this. Shannon led Reven back through the mud and slop, cutting south to avoid the pool and a portion of their trail. They took a lot less care than they had getting through it the first time. Once back far enough, he stopped and dropped to a knee. He took the bow from the quiver and loaded it. Reven took his larger bow off his back and knelt down, just within sight of Shannon. Reven had been on enough trips into warped lands and been hunted enough times that he knew the only way to escape a scan like that was to backtrack and kill the source of it. They waited, hidden in the fog, both silent and alert. It wasn't a long wait until they heard the noise of the horses and their riders slogging through the muck. Thoughts of who they were, and if they knew the truth of what the pontiff was, crept into Reven's mind. The thoughts made him almost let the bow waver. He wondered if he himself knew the truth. Reven glanced toward Shannon, wondering what the man knew, how he fit in, and just what sort of powers he possessed that enticed the pontiff into this game. He pushed the line of thoughts down as the answers dared to come. Reven waited as he got the first glimpse of their pursuer. Still, he waited. Their actions had to be well timed. With just the two of them, there was no room for mistakes.
Now,
he heard Shannon whisper in his head. Reven stood and shot an arrow at the nearest man. He unleashed another and saw 3 others collapse.
Run now,
Shannon told him. Reven bolted from the area, even as he felt the creatures within the bog begin to move in, attracted to the smell of blood. He and Shannon met up ahead of the melee behind them. They could hear the men and horses screaming and the thrashing of water and creatures. Reven was panting, but not from the run. The touch of Shannon's mind on his, the telepathy, had left him breathless. He was a dwarf, and Shannon wasn't. The power level to touch across races demanded no less than a true master, even then, only with practice. Still, there was more to it. A shield had protected him, but he had no doubt that Shannon could tear into him and burn him up from the inside out. He'd felt power like that before, but not from a man. They slowed.
Is that it then? Or will he send more after you?
Reven asked, before he realized what he had said. He wished he could suck his words back in, but he couldn't, and Shannon had heard them well enough. Shannon looked from the dwarf to the fog behind them.
Who can guess what a madman will do next? Let us just get back to the others.
Shannon sounded oddly tired and pained. They had just gotten back to the place where they had parted company when Reven swore.
I've been bit,
he said, reaching down. As he did, he began to shiver. Shannon grabbed him as he started to topple.
Purge, Reven. Get the poison out of you.
Shannon felt the dwarf start to raise the power, but it was shaky. Reven began to shudder, and his teeth ground together.
Purge!
Shannon yelled at him. The dwarf struggled to hold the power and direct it, but it scattered. The culprit brushed up against Shannon in the mud. It jerked away from his icy shield. He debated a moment, and then pulled off his glove. He slid his bare hand down the dwarf's ankle to the bite that had gone through his boots. The blood immediately began to burn Shannon. The blood of a wizard priest has no rival. There is no elixir with greater power or drug with a sweeter addiction. Shannon gritted his teeth, forcing himself to take nothing, but instead to send icy power into the priest in his care. He needed Reven alive, if he hoped to keep the company alive, and if there were any demons sent after them, the cleric was his best hope to stay free. He needed Reven. He would freeze out the poison. It was faster than fire and left less damage. It just hurt more. Reven cried out, but Shannon hardly noticed. He sent out ice and reinforced his shield to a point that he wasn't even sure how much power he was sending. Despite his shields, the blood of the dwarf burned his bare skin. He heard nothing over that screaming buzz in the back of his head that would only be silenced with satisfying the need. But he didn't need it. It was just the overwhelming response to the priest's blood. When Reven went limp in his arms, and there was no more poison, Shannon snatched his hand away. He wiped the blood onto Reven's shirt, almost frantically. He used the mucky water to wash the blood off the dwarf's shin, and washed his hand free of the last of it. He wiped the filth off his hand onto his surcoat and pulled his glove back on. Shannon was so tired from the exchange that he almost felt like crying, but he had done his share lately and simply denied it.
Reven,
he asked, weary from the struggle he'd just gone through and the continuing fight with the buzzing hunger. Reven's eyes fluttered, and he groaned. That was enough. The dwarf was conscious. He would live. Shannon stood. Once on his feet, he situated Reven to carry him like a child, and then headed after the others. Camp was set up under a dead tree, on a hill surrounded by water. They decided against a fire, as it might be seen, even through the perpetual fog, by things they would rather not know about. It was cold after the heat of the day. Oirion took the first watch, and the others all dropped to sleep. Travis cried softly most of the night.
What's wrong with him?
Ivan demanded, impatient with the child's tears.
He wants Shannon,
Tavia said, her nerves shortened by the long days and the dangers all around them.
We all do,
Kelly said, leaning over to touch the boy's head gently with her great hand. Oirion watched as something moved in the dark, sniffing closer and closer, until he had no choice but to step up and attack. It didn't expect the attack, and Oirion easily stabbed the big flat animal in the top of the head. That, he quickly decided, was a mistake, as other things moved in on the smell of blood. He had no choice but to move out further and chop at others, driving them back as they fought over the dead thing that ventured too close to camp. This process was repeated several times. After what seemed like half the night, Ivan stepped up.
I can watch for a while,
he said.
Why don't you go lay down with the others and try to get some rest?
Oirion nodded, and let the warrior take over the patrol of vigilance, guarding the small mound of earth they were camped on. Oirion circled the camp and looked for a place that was dry enough to sit down on. He settled, put out a trigger magic, and dozed off, his back to a stump of some long, rotten tree. He woke to a soft touch to his face. Cindy sat on his lap, her hands on his face. She didn't say anything, just leaned forward and kissed him. She laid her head on his shoulder and rested on him. Her move surprised him. If she had kissed him more or made any other move, he would have pushed her off, but she just hid there. Maybe she was just scared, and this was the only way she knew to not think about it. Oirion wondered how old she was and what sort of life she had before this trip. But he sank back to sleep. He was tired and just wanted to rest. No one slept well that night, and they woke early, plagued by fears of having lost both Shannon and Revan. Dead creatures littered the water. Others were feeding on them, with even more feeding on those. Cindy started to cry again, and Ivan comforted her at once. Theo watched, but didn't say anything or make any move to help his weepy wife. They were stuck on the island for the most of the day. They continued to guard in turns, to let each other rest in what safety that could be gained, and giving Shannon and Revan time to catch up. Dave had hoped Shannon would show up to take over the lead again, but they could wait no longer. The island had become surrounded by a frenzy of bloodthirsty marsh creatures. He had no choice but to lead the way off the little island. They began tossing the dead creatures that they could easily reach to one side of the island to clear a way off. As soon as most of the aggravated creatures moved around to the one side, and the way was open, Dave led the group off the island and into the interior of the bog, as much to break up Cindy and Ivan as anything. The water was waist-deep by now and full of hunger, with hidden pit holes and other dangers. Dave had to look at the shape of the land as well as the creatures that lived here. It was, by far, the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. His head was throbbing with backlash from yesterday's extended work, and today promised to be even worse. On top of all that, the lack of sleep and the aching body, from fighting and chopping at creatures during his watches, left Dave exhausted and distressed about the fact that this had only begun. Shannon had been helping all along, just at a lower level than Dave thought Shannon would waste his energy on. No one had even realized what Shannon was doing for them. Everyone was feeling Shannon's absence now, however. They were tripping and falling, too tired to even argue, and the bugs were now attacking them in full force. The pony's scream alerted Dave to the fact that they were being visited from behind. As Ivan yelled, he and Kelly ran to cut the pack from the pony's back. Dave swore under his breath, leading the way onward as fast as he could. The blood of an attack would bring more things to the area. Sloshing through the water and mud, he couldn't help in any way but to get them farther away from it. Kelly pulled at the pack as Ivan cut the strap. She was thrown back as it came loose, sending her into the water. She held the pack up over her head, though, saving the food inside. Tavia grabbed Kelly, pulling her back, allowing her to get her footing. A massive snake wrapped around the struggling pony and pulled it under. The legs of the pony and the pulsing green and gray coils of the serpent thrashed in the water, stirring up mud and debris from the bottom, creating a thick mess of boiling motion. Other snakes were already on the way to join the frenzied feast. The group struggled on at a faster pace, certain that the things would come after them, looking for more food. After a tense hour, it seemed that they weren't going to be eaten by the snakes, but the fear remained with them the rest of the day. Oirion made them stop as the darkness began to creep in around them. He had spotted a slight mound, muddy, but where they would at least be out of the water. More than ever, he missed Jamie. Jamie was much better at setting up camp magic and would have loved this place for all the unknowns and things to be discovered about it. However, Oirion did know enough from Jamie's studies and the years they had traveled together that he was able to fashion what Jamie called a tent. It was a sort of bubble of power that would keep them dry and hold in their body heat to some extent. Oirion couldn't hope to hold them all in it at the level that he was used to having with Jamie. but by deflating it and folding it over to make a sort of magic tarp, they all had a dry place to lie down and get some sleep. He could have tried for more, but magic shields were even more important than being dry, and he didn't have the energy to do both. Not only that, but the use of the power would also draw in other things, and he wanted this exhausted group to be able to sleep. Kelly nodded to Oirion.
Sleep, I can watch a bit.
He wasn't so sure she could, but he was too tired to argue. The shield should hold, and sleep should be safe, at least for a while. He wished he had used this magic the night before. They would all be far better off tonight if he had. He realized that he was going to have to stop holding things in check and just use his magic, or they were all going to suffer for it. Oirion awoke sometime after moon-up, his whole body hurting. He was suffering from the attacks on his shields that had been going on as he slept. Being tied into the magic, he was becoming exhausted by these attacks. He lay there awake, too tired to get up, but unable to sleep. He was momentarily concerned for Kelly. He sat up and looked around for her. She was standing on the very edge of his tarp, looking eastward, likely watching for Shannon and Reven. Motion pulled his eyes back to the others. His tired mind took a while to calculate what he was seeing, and not until after he had lain back down did he comprehend it. Cindy had crawled over to Ivan, and the motion was the two of them under Ivan's blanket. Oirion just laid there, thinking about challenging the adultery, but he fell back to sleep before he had the strength to decide if it was real or just his tired mind playing tricks. Everyone in camp was tired and slow in the morning. They were all hurting far worse than they had before. Travis left his mother as she tried to prepare them a meal. He went to Theo and crawled up in his lap, snuggling into the man's slender arms. Theo held the boy a little awkwardly, but he was not about to ask him to get up. Theo looked like a wet, beaten dog, ready to just fall over and die. Poor kid. Oirion was surprised that he felt any sort of sympathy at all for a man who so reminded him of his brother. He got up and walked over to Tavia to help her find food and rework the packs for the ponies. The ponies were no less tired than the company and stood with their heads hung low. They woke Dave last, and he ate as he struggled to stay conscious. Once he swallowed the last morsel, he was up and guiding them off the tarp, back into the swampy bog. Oirion left the tarp and just cut himself off from it. As the magic in it broke down, it would call the dangerous things to it and keep them busy, while the group got farther and farther from them. They traveled through the muck all day. There was nowhere to stop and nowhere to rest. Even as the sun went down, they had to keep going. The moons rose, giving Tavia enough light to stop and dig into the pack that Kelly carried. She pulled out a loaf of bread and a block of cheese. Tearing them apart with her hands, she delivered pieces to everyone as they walked. They were all grateful and devoured the meal quickly without any talking. It had been all day since they had eaten, the fear of another attack overriding hunger and weariness. Finally, Dave made them stop, as they were so worn out that the pace they were walking was hardly more than a crawling snail's pace. They used an old stump of a dead tree as a backrest and sat around it, their shoulders holding each other up, as they fell asleep in nearly a foot of wet, slimy mud. Shannon had to stop. Fighting with the vampire in himself was not easy. It would have driven a lesser man insane, pushing him into the madness. He sat down on a small hill of dirt. He was tired, and Reven was still too weak to even sit up. The sun had gone down already, and the larger bugs were gathering, sensing the poor state of both men. Shannon drew up a shield of power around the two of them and dropped away. He woke early, as refreshed as he was going to get. Gathering Reven up, he headed out again after the others. It was late evening when they came to an area teeming with massive snakes.
Who died?
Reven asked weakly. He rode on Shannon's back, conscious but too weak to walk on his own. Shannon scanned the water and the energies.
One of the ponies.
Shannon circled around the area and then moved back onto the path that the others had left. As he went, he absorbed the energy. This would hide the trail from their pursuers, and it helped keep Shannon from getting tired or losing the battle with the powers within. The group was both scared and powerful. They didn't have the sort of shields to hide that, let alone block Shannon's use of it. He had to do something as well to keep his mind off the priest on his back. It was like asking a man dying of thirst to carry water across the desert to a horse. Only exceptional self-will could make any man even try. Raven was struggling to shield himself, but the power just wasn't holding. However, the effort he put forth did help. The fact that the priest was trying to protect himself had a great cooling effect. If Raven hadn't been trying so hard, Shannon wasn't so sure how well he would have fared. Raven wasn't shielding against Shannon as much as the bog creatures, but at that point, there wasn't much difference. Shortly after sunrise, he was forced to stop again. He had to put Raven down and get away from him. Shannon walked away and stood, shaky and sick. It was tempting to just go, to play dead and run, to escape this place and all its problems. He even took a step to do so, but fell to his knees. He couldn't leave Dave. Oirion flicked into his mind as well. Shannon looked up to the heavens. The light burned his eyes, and he covered them with his hand, choking on a sob.
Please, God, help me,
he whispered in Purton.
Not so much for me. I ask nothing for myself anymore, but for them, for those who do not realize what I am. Help me, and in doing so, save them.
The sun was just coming up. A gray light filled the world and lit the fog into deceptive brightness. Dave scanned for the dry place that he had felt and had been heading for since Shannon had left them. The dryness stretched out westward in a straight line, a dam perhaps, he thought. It wasn't far now. Stopping again to lift his eyes from the immediate surroundings and the threats around them, he looked and adjusted his course to reach it. The deep, dark pools, slick mud, and ever-shifting mosses seemed to keep pulling him off course. It almost felt like part of the maliciousness of the place was acting against him. His head pounded worse than it ever had. He felt sick, and his eyes were constantly tearing up, but he kept going. They had lost another pony, the pack included this time, and nearly lost Travis as well. The boy had been resting on the pony's pack when the group had been attacked by some unseen monster. It had come from below and without warning. Somehow, Kelly had managed to grab Travis free before the poor little pack animal vanished under the mud. No one wanted to stop. Oirion had taken up the rear, doing something similar to what Dave was doing. He was using his inborn wizardry magics that he rarely touched on to be sure they weren't attacked from behind again. The fog parted, and there it was. It rose out of the muck, the sides formed of great boulders. It promised to be dry. With a sigh of relief, he started for it. Cindy saw it as well. She let out a shriek of delight and bolted for it. Without any thought of caution, she dashed forward, out into a very smooth section of water that looked safe, but which Dave knew was definitely not as it appeared to be. He sprang after her with a shout, surprised that he had the energy left.
Keep them going,
Dave yelled at Oirion as he ran after her, but he wasn't fast enough. She went into the hole just inches from his fingertips. She screamed, Ivan roared, Oirion and Theo both yelled. One yelled at Dave, the other at Cindy. Dave carefully circled the hole that she had fallen into. She was up to her armpits in mud.
Don't just stand there. Help me out,
she said angrily to Dave. But it was too late. Already blood was seeping up around her and her face was going white. He knelt before her and offered out a hand. She took it, expecting him to pull her up, but as he sank down, his knees as near her as he dared, he tried not looking at the blood that was pooling around her.
Dave, help me,
she pleaded, not sure why he was hesitating.
I can't,
he said, dangerously close to the swarm that he could see eating her. The pain began to register, and she started to cry. The mud here was alive, and it was eating her body like some sort of acid. It pulled her in a little deeper.
Oh God,
she gasped.
Dave, I don't want to die.
You're human, you never die. Your soul will be reborn.
He smiled as encouragingly as he could. He had held the hands of dying men before, but they had always been old and had known how to avoid their deaths. Cindy was a foolish girl, and no more.
Dave, I don't want to drown in mud.
She screamed a little when she was tugged down even more. Her shoulders were under now. Dave sent a sharp bolt of power down the hand he held. She went limp. Her head fell back. He had killed her, sparing her the horror of being sucked under. He watched as she was tugged down, the mud closing over her open eyes. That image would haunt him, but he didn't let go. He let her hand slip from his only when she was totally under. He was too tired, too weak to get up. He just knelt there, lost in exhaustion and the pounding of his head, the others yelling off in some faraway haze. He should get up, but he just didn't have the strength. He slowly toppled sideways and fell into his own darkness.
Dave.
Dave woke slowly. It was raining. He was lying in the mud and was sore. His bones felt as if they were so brittle, any movement would shatter them. He couldn't think where he was or how he had gotten there. Slowly he forced open his heavy eyes. Shannon and Raven were kneeling beside him. Raven looked as tired and sick as Dave felt. He blinked, trying to clear the scratchiness out of his eyes. He had to struggle to even think.
Can you walk?
Shannon asked. Dave tried to get up but made little progress, until Shannon grabbed him by the back of the shirt and pulled him up. He leaned against Shannon, too shaky to move yet. Dave saw that Raven clung to Shannon's back. He thought that was a little odd, but couldn't think why. The thought of walking made his knees nearly give out. He wanted to just lie down and sleep. Shannon jerked him back up, took hold of his belt in the back, and forced him forward.
Cindy's dead,
Dave said hollowly, remembering where he was and why.
I know. Do not talk and try not to think. You drained yourself.
The climb up the steep stone embankment was a lot of work for all involved. Dave kept nodding off, and Raven was so tired that he could barely hang on. Halfway to the top of the hill of boulders, Ivan met them with a sword. He almost dropped it with relief when he saw who it was. He grabbed Dave up and carried him the rest of the way. The top of the hill was flat and wide. They had set up the one tent that they still had, and even had a small fire going.
Oirion said we had to move to safety before someone could go back to help Dave,
Ivan said, in apology for the seeming neglect of Dave.
They need to sleep,
Shannon said, ignoring the big man. Kneeling down, he helped Raven around into his arms and handed him over to Oirion, who took him and went with Ivan to the shelter. They laid Raven and Dave down beside each other.
What happened?
Ivan asked Shannon, as the Purton took the cup of tea Tavia offered.
He got bit by a snake,
Shannon said wearily, taking a sip of the tea. He set the cup down and walked away from the camp a bit, just out of sight, then slowly sank to the stone and lay still. He had to get some rest, but he couldn't do it next to a priest. He still felt too close, but at least he was here. How he had made it, he was still unsure, but he was here.
For what it's worth, thank you.
He breathed to the sky before he passed out. What they had come to was a highway. It was about 20 feet wide and perfectly straight. On its surface, there were great runes of strength and preservation. 1,000 feet back in the bog, the road had collapsed. Black scars of magic blasts were a mute testament that the road had not fallen down, but had been the victim of some mage war, likely the same one that had warped the land here into a living, thriving cesspool of dark emotions. Tavia headed back up from the crumbled end, where she had wandered off alone. Everyone was resting. They had had a full day of rest now, and were still sleeping. Even Shannon was asleep, she thought. Out of the mist, she saw Oirion approaching. She didn't know what to think about that man. She shouldn't think anything about him. He was a priest, but what she did think wasn't bad. Until he would open his mouth and say something to ruin it. He didn't seem to say much, unless he was being a total ass to Shannon. Didn't he realize that without Shannon, they would all be dead right now?
Is Travis awake?
She asked, wondering why he had come out here.
No, everyone's asleep, even Shannon,
he said with an odd note in his voice, almost humor, but not quite.
I just came to see if you wanted any company.
He seemed almost nervous, she thought, and almost laughed at the idea that she could make a priest as famous and powerful as Oirion nervous. Did he think that she didn't know who he was?
There's not much to talk about,
She said.
I know, we don't have to talk. Maybe just walk ahead and see what the road does.
He offered hopefully. She considered it. Did she really want to spend their day of rest walking?
We can do that.
She said. They walked back up the road, past the tent and the sleepers, and on farther, slowly, almost leisurely.
It must be hard to raise a child alone,
Oirion said finally, in a way that made her think he had something else on his mind, and was just trying to lead up to it.
That's not the hard part,
She said.
Why were you on the ship? Did you have family where you were going?
No, actually. What family I had died a few years ago.
She was not about to tell Oirion who she was or what her life was. There was enough strain between him and Shannon for all of them. She dug her hands into her pockets, wondering how it was that the air was still so hot here. Hot springs were the only thing she could think it might be. They were too far north and too high up for it to be climate.
So you're a survivor wherever you go.
He said it as a compliment, and she smiled kindly at the thought.
You have a place that will be waiting for you at home?
I have a little place,
She said. She would have left it at that, but Oirion was going to pry, and it would be better to give little truths rather than to lie to direct questions.
It's nothing grand, but it has what I need, and it'll be waiting for me. It could be worse. I could be a renter and have all I own taken when I'm late.
Were you headed home or away from it?
I was headed to Stalik to meet an old friend. You?
I was headed to Krish.
He held his hands behind his back.
I was going to catch the train home from there. It's faster to go that way than to cross the mountains this time of year.
He half laughed and wiped the sweat off his brow.
You'd never know it was supposed to be the end of fall. I'd hate to be here in the summer.
They walked on in silence for a ways, before they stopped at one of those blast marks. It was far enough, so they turned and headed back.
Have you ever noticed that Shannon doesn't sweat?
Oirion asked, wiping his face again.
Porthans are a high-altitude race. If they don't regulate their temperature in the heat with magic, a racial magic that they all seem to have, they will have a stroke and die. I'm sure he's constantly suffering from the heat. He just deals with it differently. Porthans are definitely a different race than humans. It surprises me that we can even crossbreed as easily as we do. It's not just physical, either. Porthans are simply not like humans.
How so?
Porthans are very slow to adapt. It's why you don't see them out and about. They can't accept that things have changed. They tend to die of grief rather than old age. The elves say that grief is the only death of a Porthan. Old age as such is as rare to them as to elves. Their average lifespan is 2,000 years, easily, and that's not counting the wizards. I have been told that humans will grieve for decades, but a Porthan will grieve for centuries. Some will suffer longer from the loss of love than the love lasted to begin with. It's really a sad thought. We humans have great advantages over them in the way of our hearts. We are designed to recover and move on.
We have to. Our lives are far shorter than some of the other races.
She just nodded. It was partly true. There was so much to this topic. She could go on for a good while about it, but she let it go and just walked with the priest back to camp.
How do you feel?
Dave opened his eyes. Shannon sat beside him. Raven was gone, and he could hear the others outside talking to each other. Dave tried to move and heard himself groan.
Sore.
He said.
Does your head hurt at all?
Not anymore.
You came dangerously close to getting yourself killed.
I figured I would be all right. We had to keep moving, and I didn't dare risk not using sight. Besides, we were almost there.
David, you are not an adept wizard. You cannot just keep a sustained sight on. You could have damaged yourself.
I didn't think that you'd be gone so long. I just did what I felt was necessary.
That is very noble of you, David. But you are not the only one who could have led the group. You should have taken turns and conserved your strength.
I didn't think about it. I'm not an apprentice who would think about that sort of thing. I'm a sailor.
You're a long way from the ocean right now, and you are not an apprentice either. You are a journeyman who does not think and is not aware of what he can do yet.
I'm no wizard.
Dave sat up, a little surprised. Of all of the men who spent their entire lives in training, very few ever reached the level of journeyman before they were in their later years. It was all the higher that most of them went. He hardly felt like he had that sort of power.
You are.
I don't feel like a wizard.
Right now, yes, you do. Wizardry is not the most comfortable thing in the world. The harder you push, the more power you can attain, and if you survived your reckless nobility, you will have gained no small amount of power. It is, as I explained to you when you were young. The more you do, the more you can do. As you use your energy, more pours into the vacuum and expands your potential. Every time you use magic, new energy pours into you. The more you use, the more that rushes in, and the faster it rushes.
I know that, but why do I hurt so bad?
Dave asked miserably.
You gave yourself a backlash.
A what?
A backlash. It is when the energy that rushes in exceeds the energy that you had to begin with. When wizards drain themselves to their cores, they get a backlash. What you are feeling is from the energy that is rushing in, to fill the empty spaces that you drained. It makes you feel like your brain will explode, and your bones are made of glass. They ache, and your muscles feel torn.
So the backlash is all that extra energy pulled in by the vacuum that is created by using power?
Dave asked to be certain he understood.
If you create a large vacuum, you create a sudden rush that lasts about twice as long as the use itself. It fills you and stretches you out. The momentum of the incoming energy slows gradually. To say that you felt like you were going to be ripped apart is exactly what is happening, only it is occurring in the soul more than in the flesh.
Could it kill you?
Yes, in two ways. First, the power might not come back fast enough, and the beating of your heart would drain you. The other way would be if it came back too rapidly, hitting you so hard and fast that your insides exploded. It happens more than you would realize. A wizard that ages does so because he is using only a small amount of power at a time, not enough to cause new energy to rush in. They are trickling out their lives, a little at a time. That is why it is not advisable to get in the habit of using your power for menial things. If you do not need it, do not use it.
Like lighting candles?
Dave asked, remembering the first time Shannon had taught him to do it. He had told him not to do that unless there was no other way.
Exactly.
Is that why you don't use magic very often for anything little?
That is the basis for that, yes.
So I hurt a lot right now. Is that a sign that I've grown?
It is. But the backlash you suffer is only an indication of the chance to grow. It is not equal to the growth. If you swell up so big, only about 1/10 of what you swell to is what you will retain, and even then, only if you continue to use your powers. Magic is much like a muscle. If you stop using the muscle, you will grow weak, even if it remains there. To get the strength of a great warrior, you must work it, push it, and then maintain at that level. Wizards are often seen as arrogant, since they seem to be constantly reminding others of their powers, or just flat out showing off. But staying active is how they keep the balance. They are working for gain, or at least to maintain. What you did was a bit extreme, though, David.
So if you don't use it, you lose it?
Dave asked, rubbing at his temples.
In a way, you are given so much in your core, and you can never lose that.
Shannon paused a moment.
Unless, of course, your cores are burned away or damaged beyond repair, as with your father, but all the backlash growths you can lose.
So, it's a line of balance that needs to be kept between reserving energy and not neglecting what has been gained.
It is what all wizards must learn.
So even though I am in great pain right now from this, if I have to do it again, I will be able to.
Better than you did, if you continue to work the magic,
Shannon added.
The more a wizard pushes, the more powerful they get. It is why so many become obsessive with the study and works of power.
Dave was amazed, not so much at the conversation, but for the fact that he was sitting here talking to Shannon. He hadn't been able to do that since he was little. He had become too afraid of Shannon to do a lot of the things they had once done together.
How old are you?
Dave asked suddenly. He had always wondered, but he had never had the reason to ask.
Older than I look.
Shannon said.
You're not going to tell me?
No.
Dad said that.
He stopped, suddenly realizing what he was about to say.
What does your father say?
Shannon asked.
He says that you were a priest once, but that you fought a war with the demons, and it changed you.
Your father is a smart man.
Shannon said. He smiled faintly.
But you hate priests.
No, not at all. I hate the church they serve, not their god or the men they are. I respect Revan and Oirion.
He half shook his head.
In another life, we might have actually been friends.
Does he hate you out of fear then?
No, it's because he sees what he could become, even if he doesn't realize it.
Shannon paused.
Why not try to get up now? We have been here for 3 days. I think it is time we move on.
Shannon moved out of the tent, giving Dave time to get dressed and follow when he was ready. Dave considered not going out. Shannon had said try, but then he knew that it was time to go, or Shannon would have let him sleep. He pushed off the blanket and reached for the clothes beside the bed. On either side of the road, the bog went on, now a lake of festering mud. The fog had lifted in places, leaving the group exposed to the full heat of the late autumn sun and the foul reek of the bog. Oirion wondered, as he wiped his brow of sweat, how Shannon was able to survive in all that black leather he wore.
Water.
Ivan offered his canteen to Oirion. Oirion took a swig of the warm water. It was a nice gesture from anyone, especially a man as selfish as Ivan.
Ivan, what do you think about Shannon?
He asked. He felt like talking to someone, and even Ivan was better than no one. Before, he had Jamie always talking to him, and now the endless quiet as they walked was getting to him.
I don't know,
Ivan said.
I mean, when we first met him, he gave me the creeps, but now...
He shrugged.
I asked Revan what happened out there. I guess Shannon carried him the entire way, after saving him from the poison. I'm a lot bigger than Shannon, and I don't think I could have done it. Hiking through that mud wasn't easy, and have you seen how he is with that kid? It sure feels that whatever happens, he will do whatever he can to keep us alive. But why? I mean, he has to be someone important, and we are just a bunch of nobodies, except you and Revan. And you two don't need him. The rest of us, though...
He shrugged his massive shoulders again and ran a hand over his new crop of gray hair.
Would you still feel the same if he turned out to be a dark wizard?
Maybe it's not the way I should feel, but if he is, then I'm all the more impressed. Besides, I don't think it matters what you are, as much as what you do with your powers. And all he has done is take care of us.
They walked along together, not talking. Oirion was actually impressed by the man's response. He'd have to rethink how he perceived Ivan if the man kept talking like that.
So you like Tavia?
Ivan asked finally.
She's a good woman.
She's pretty damn nice to look at too. Don't tell me that just because you wear that ring you are blind.
My eyes work just fine, Ivan.
Well, you going to do anything about it?
About what?
Her. I mean, you and I, we're like mates now, you know, and I wouldn't want to step on your toes and take your woman, but someone should be holding that. A woman like that shouldn't be alone. It's a sin, Oirion, a sin.
Oirion laughed at the thought of Ivan holding Tavia. Those two fought way too much, but he had to admit that the man really wasn't as stupid as he put on. He couldn't help but think that it actually was a sin to sleep with another man's wife. But he shook his head and let it pass. It seemed a little cold of Ivan to already be thinking of another woman. The thought occurred to him that Ivan, apparently, didn't think of Theo as a man worthy of being considered a mate. The weather was miserable, both hot and raining. The summer sun was lost to a constant drizzle from low clouds, and nothing stayed dry. They hiked along, dripping in the rain. Anything that was said turned into an argument. With so much humidity in the air, it was hard to breathe, and none of them felt very good. But the priests had felt several scans to the rear and kept pushing them along. They marched with their heads down and nearly ran right into orcs on the road. Their scent was lost in the reek of the bog. This time, even Revan was taken by surprise. They were not orcs like they had seen in other places, but like the one that Shannon had seen on the altar. His leg actually began to ache when he saw them. At the same time, he knew that this was a different nation and not at all related to the other one. There were 6 men in robes of black wool. They carried a dead one on their shoulders. The groups came face to face, startling each other as they emerged through the rain.
"Step aside,"
Shannon ordered his company, moving up from the back of the line to ensure that they did. He couldn't help but study the orcs. These were more human-looking than the other one he had seen. They were tall and stood upright. They still had snouts, but it was less pig-like and more bear-like. Their hair was long, black, and done up in 100 slender braids. They were not the brutal animals of the other lands. The rest of the group stepped out of the way and let them pass. They moved on, giving Shannon a slightly startled look.
"Oh, wow,"
the one who trailed behind the others said to Shannon as she passed. She was old and likely the widow of the dead.
"Aos,"
Shannon replied softly. The language was still similar, though, and Shannon knew the simple greeting from the magic of the orc woman and her efforts to make peace. Revan stared after them in wonder. He had never seen anything like them before. These were no orcs, and yet they were.
"What the hell was that?"
Oirion demanded of Shannon once the procession had passed. He stepped up to battle over morals again. He was short-tempered, and Shannon had just pushed him too far. The heat was killing him. His old scars hurt. His lungs didn't want to work, and there was Shannon in black leather, looking like the angel of death, all cool and beautiful. Oirion hated him.
"Of all the people to understand,"
Shannon responded,
"I would think that a priest would be the first. Or has your pontiff taught that unarmed mourners are fair game if they do not obey his rules?"
Shannon had just about enough of Orion's attitude. It was all he could do to focus on his own shields, and not on the priest and the people who were so miserable. God, he could taste the power, the sweetness, the moment of wholeness that was just a breath away. He could take it, draw it in, and just for a split moment, be healed. He was almost in tears inside over the yearning to be whole again, and now Oirion was picking a fight.
"Orcs, not people, they were orcs."
Elves used to say the same thing about humans. You need a lesson in tolerance, holy man. You are convinced that I am a monster, but I am not the one with such bloody disregard. Wake up, Oirion. Your church is a hypocritical path to hell.
Oirion grabbed his sword, ready to draw it. Shannon displayed a stern calm. He didn't turn nor flinch, his eyes cold and challenging. Revan put his hand on Orion's arm.
"Calm yourself, brother,"
Revan said.
"Those were unlike any orcs I have ever seen. Let it go. We don't need enemies here, and we certainly don't need to fight amongst ourselves."
Oirion slowly relaxed, removed his hand, and drew a deep breath. Inside, he knew better. He knew Shannon would win, and that Revan was right. He turned away at Revan's touch, trying to hide the fact that he couldn't face Shannon's eyes. Shannon turned and started back up the road.
"How dare he speak so of the church?"
Oirion said.
"He's Pertan,"
Tavia said.
"He is a native of Norwood, and he is far older than he looks. Maybe he's seen something that gave him a reason for his feelings."
"He's a heretic and dark wizard."
"Is he?"
Revan said.
"If he is, tell me how he taught Dave to use a holy shield. Tell me why he saved my life when, to a dark wizard, my blood would be an elixir of unimaginable power. And know well, Oirion, that he had my blood on his hands, and he did nothing. Whatever he is, he's our ally, and right now we need every ally we can get."
Maybe he stole your soul and would have you forget it."
Oirion had noticed Revan said it was Shannon who taught Dave, but at that moment he decided not to push that comment at all. He just let it go.
"Maybe you'll be the next one he has to save, and maybe he might hesitate because you're such an ass to him, but then again, he might not because he's a good man,"
Revan said softly, scolding the subordinate priest in a low tone so the others didn't hear. He left Oirion to think about it and jogged off to catch up to the others following Shannon. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter and would like to hear more, please like and subscribe to our channel. It helps more than you know. More chapters are available. Join our Patreon at patreon.com/2ravens801.